Okay.
Every time.
So I'm Elizabeth. I'll introduce myself again, but just nice to see everyone here.
And I'm Celeste from Youth Climate Lab, and I'll be co-hosting and just hanging out here to learn about all the things Elizabeth has to share and facilitate today with us. See some familiar names and some unfamiliar names, so welcome in. I see Rose, Brina, Chuck, what's up? Maggie, hello. It's nice to meet and see you all.
Okay, let me I'll pull up the slides. You want to get started?
Yeah, sure. Let's dive in.
Okay, great. Okay, can everyone see the screen? Awesome. Celeste, did you want to kick it off a little bit with kind of what we're doing tonight?
Yeah, sounds good. So welcome in. Thank you all for being here. Give yourselves a clap for showing up on your evenings and afternoons. It's great to be here. And welcome to our webinar Q&A on putting your money where it matters. So this will be an interactive Q&A space and also a mini presentation from Elizabeth Landau, who's here from GreenPortfolio. And the goal of this space is really to talk through all things climate finance around putting your personal finances, especially where your values lay. So thinking about greening your finances as youth and what can we do in our day-to-day lives, and also when thinking about investing to support kind of the climate values that we share. Not that we all have the same climate values, but just not putting our money in big oil essentially, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So super excited to be here. Again, this is hosted in collaboration with GreenPortfolio and Youth Climate Lab. So we have primarily a youth audience here. And I can say a few words on Youth Climate Lab, and then I'll toss it over to you, Elizabeth.
Great. There you go.
Sweet. So yes, Youth Climate Lab. So I'm the community manager at Youth Climate Lab. And the organization, we've been around for about 5 years. We are a nonprofit and a global lab focused on accelerating youth-led climate policy projects and businesses. We're a team of young people based in so-called Canada, and we're all driven by the urgency of the climate crisis and also the state of climate in action in Canada and across the globe. So really supporting youth with the tools, the spaces, the people power and the financial capacity to really build and vision the just climate resilient futures that we are worthy of and that we inherently should be living. So our vision is for young people, no matter who they are or where they're from, to catalyze transformative climate action in their communities to the highest levels of decision making. So again, we work from cohort programs right on the ground to kind of policy spaces where we do high level infiltration. So very fluid there. And there's a few YCL folks in the space today. So hello and good to see you. And yeah, I'll toss it off to Elizabeth to introduce herself as well. And just want to shout out Elizabeth for being here and collaborating with us on this. It's really been a joy.
Oh, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. And I love the work that Youth Climate Lab does. We're really fortunate to be able to spotlight you last summer as ways to get involved. So I'm happy we're doing something together again. I'm Elizabeth Landau. I am the co-founder of GreenPortfolio. We'll talk a little about what we're up to, but really it's just to help you understand the climate impact of your money. So whether it be your bank account, an investment, eventually we'll also look at other financial products like credit cards, but helping you use your financial decisions as a tool to, fight climate change and for climate activism. And so let's see. So I guess I wanted to start off with actually a couple questions. So if you have like a bank account or an investment, raise your hand. And have you actually thought about, do you actually understand what your money is up to? Do you understand if you're invested in fossil fuels, or if your bank is lending to fossil fuels, or if they're supporting climate solutions? Lower your hand if you know that. You all know that. Okay, I think it didn't work out. Yeah, okay. So anyway, that's why we're here. I'm going to try to give you some tips. So we're going to link, how does climate and climate change relate to finance? Going to go through some greenwashing, some terms, tips for kind of what to look out for and how to look at these things as you're starting to maybe, pick a bank or, venture into the investment world, and then eventually how we can really help you with GreenPortfolio. And so I just want to start off also with a reminder that this presentation is for like informational purposes only. So it's really to help you in your research. So you still, despite me, giving you this information, you still need to make sure you're doing your own due diligence when you're selecting your financial products. One thing we do have actually, because we're not going to distribute these slides afterwards, but there will be a recording posted on Youth Climate Lab's YouTube channel. We do have this companion guide. So if you want to go to greenportfolio.com/guide, it's just a quick kind of summary, a little shorter than this, of like just some of the tips I'm going to talk about today. And if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Celeste is going to be taking a look at that as we go through, and then we'll also have plenty of time at the end for questions. Okay, so to kind of start off, like we're all here because we all care about climate in one way or another, and climate change, is still a big problem that we need to solve. So this is information pulled from Climate Action Tracker, and what they do is look at the commitments towards net zero, the pledges, on a government, like on a corporate scale, and map out, where are we going to be? And there's still a giant gap, which you can see here in terms of like where pledges and commitments and policies lie and where we really need to be. So I'm happy that everyone's here thinking about this because we have a lot of work to do. The good news is that climate investment has continued to increase globally year over year. So the Climate Policy Initiative tracks this. They kind of classify climate finance investment as, going directly into like renewable energy, and then also the like tangential like industries that would help support, shifting to more climate positive practices. And you can see like the line's really gone up, which is really good. This is great news. However, and I don't want to continue talking about the bad, we'll get into the good, but the line that I just showed you where it looked like it was, drastically increasing is this little line here. And based on what is being estimated in terms of financing where we need to be somewhere in this range up here. And there's a big gap. And we also know this is not something that really can be like done on a linear scale. We need to have a lot more of like upfront investment to make sure that we're, where we need to be in like 2030 and 2050. So still a lot of work to do, which is why, voicing, where you think your money needs to go and, being the squeaky wheel for these corporations is important. So that's kind of a little bit about how it starts to connect. Before we start going deeper, I just wanted to kind of touch base a little bit on probably a lot of phrases and terms you're seeing thrown around a lot online if you started looking into this. And this is, really my definitions of these, but I'm trying to like show you how they all vary a little bit. So sustainable investing, it's really like a generic term, and it kind of has a bunch of different buckets and potential frameworks underneath it. So, three of the big ones that get thrown out a lot, socially responsible investing. So this is, eliminating or selecting an investment based on certain guidelines around your ethics. So usually it's like when you're eliminating a lot of the bad. So like not, investing in tobacco or weapons and making sure that's removed from what you're investing in. Impact is kind of like the opposite, where you want to move towards positive impact in some way. So whether it be like related to gender equality, carbon footprinting, like climate positive products, that's kind of what that falls into. And then there's environmental, social, and governance, also called ESG investing. And this is actually like a framework that's used by like the financial world. And it looks at a company performance across a variety of factors in these areas, more so to try and determine how that will affect a company's long-term success. We'll go into this a little bit more later, but it's not a reflection on what that company is necessarily doing to impact those areas. And I'll kind of show you that a little bit in one of the next couple slides, what I mean there. Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to look at closely was emissions reporting. And this ties to banks, ties to all companies, but there's 3 levels that get reported today. Scope 1, which is the easiest one for a company or a bank to assess. So this is, direct emissions produced by the sources that the company owns and controls. So this could be like their office, their vehicle fleet, things like that. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions from purchased electricity. So also fairly easy for them to report. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are typically what you're seeing a lot of companies talk about and a lot of banks talk about. So scope 3 is further out from the company. So this is indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain, which means it could be the ingredients going into a product. It could be the employees commuting. It could be how the products are shipped, into industry. It also includes investments. And that's why it's really important when you're looking at banks to see what they're saying about scope 3 emissions, because there's category 15. There's like even subcategories in here related to lending and investments. And those investments can be going and funding fossil fuel exploration. And so if that's something that you do not want to support, it's important to understand that. Believe it was, let me just check my sources here. I believe it was Carbon Disclosure Project. The greenhouse gas emissions from a number of financial institutions that they looked at, their scope 3 emissions were 700 times greater than scope 1. So when you see, like emissions reporting or a company or a bank saying they're carbon neutral or net zero and moving to net zero plans, why I'm telling you this is it's just important to go beneath that to see what they're actually saying and what's actually included, because it's not always comprehensive. And like an example of this, so greenwashing, right? So when you're not necessarily being fully transparent about what you are and aren't doing to affect the climate, misleading marketing claims in this area about sounding greener than you are is called greenwashing. And unfortunately, because there's so much interest now from people like us, there are a lot of good players out there, but there are also a lot of bad ones. And they're taking advantage of the fact that you want a product that helps the environment and not necessarily being fully truthful. And so here's kind of an example. JP Morgan Chase. So this is like the largest, bank in the US. This is Earth Day from 2021. They talked about the amount of money that they're trickling into like climate change and sustainable development. Again, when you look at the ratios there and what they're deeming is that, it's not super clear. And at the end of the day, the last 6 years, they've been the world's leading funder of fossil fuels running. So $382 billion just in the last 6 years alone. So it's just important that you try to match these things up and see what the good and what the bad truly are. Now, there's other companies in the space that are trying to market themselves as being green, and they aren't necessarily backing that up. So this was a ProPublica article from last year. So there's Aspiration. So it's considered a green bank, climate friendly bank. They really haven't backed up a lot of what they've been saying they were supposed to be doing. So a lot of the marketing that they've used. So one, it's only been about tree planting, and like tree planting is good, but it's not as effective as some of the other things they could be doing with people's money to actually support, climate solutions. But even that, like they were, I think, reporting a number that, like a committed planting number. Meanwhile, though, like most of the trees had not actually been planted. So it was kind of implying that like a lot more good had happened than had actually happened yet. So, and this is all things that you can kind of see in the fine print, like on their website. And ProPublica did a good job, like kind of like looking into it. So moving away from banks for a second and shifting back to investing and what I was talking about before around ESG investing. So if you look at this chart, so there's 3 oil companies. The gray bar is the environmental score that they have in their ESG score. So the way an ESG score works, there's like a comprehensive overall rating, and then there's like 1 for E, 1 for S, and 1 for G. So this is out of 100. And then in the green bar, that's like a green revenue score that, one of the ratings companies has calculated. So looking at this, they're oil companies. How are they scoring such high marks on environment? So the way this works in most ESG frameworks is they're compared to peers in industry. So this is like these 3 companies are being compared to each other and how much E in terms of the factors they've done versus other oil companies. And so it's misleading, right? Like, so you might be able to say like, maybe these 3, I haven't looked at all of them, but like maybe these 3 are like some of the better oil companies. But then when you look at it just quickly at face value, you would think maybe like they're really, really good and they're doing like amazing things for the environment. And that's why it gets confusing to people. And it's not, so that's why I say that ESG investing is not the same as impact investing. And it's tough because these greenwashing concerns like are one of the biggest, I think it's the second biggest factor that people are concerned about and why they haven't, switched to fully sustainable investing. Morgan Stanley puts out like a survey every year, and they talk to Gen Z, millennials, and also other generations as well. And these were kind of the top 4 areas and reasons why people had not yet started investing in a sustainable manner, despite an overwhelming interest to do so. And so, greenwashing, that's the big thing that we're trying to help you comb through. Lack of tools to measure that impact, also trying to help with that. And then reduce the time and effort needed to like look through all this information. Because I'll give you some tips now on like what you can start doing to look to make sure that you're not being fooled by misleading marketing, but it is a very cumbersome effort. So we can start going through that, and we can start with banks. And so with banks, you really want to look at like the level of fossil fuel financing. So this is something that you can find in their annual reports. There's also a report that comes out annually. The Rainforest Action Network puts it out. It's called Banking on Climate Chaos. And they have looked at the global largest 60 banks since Paris Agreement, looking year by year how the investments are actually flowing into the fossil fuel industry. they do like a really comprehensive deep dive into the different sections and different types of financing available to fossil fuel companies. And so this is, looking at the last 6 years, kind of the totals where, the biggest financiers net out. And I would also say that it's important to look for disclosures about climate positive investment. A lot of banks will put out like ESG frameworks and statements. You have to kind of comb through that to find the stuff that's actually doing good, rather than just a lot of things that they're measuring internally. And then there's also like climate friendly banks. They're usually smaller. They're usually not the big banks. There's, that they'll actually tell you where the money's going when it's loaned out, or show you commitments to what they're not doing. So for example, Clean Energy Credit Union, it's a smaller bank, but they've been around for a long time, and they're really great about transparency. You have to sign up to be part of like an environmental group, but there's some that you can sign up that are only like, I think like a $10 membership fee, and you can have an account with them. And I believe it's on a quarterly basis. They kind of put out, how much money is going to different types of loans, whether it's like solar loans or electric vehicle loans to their clients. And then there's also Atmos Financial. They are focused on climate friendly banking as well. They have a bunch of nonprofits they've vetted that they support, and like you can contribute part of your interest to them, or they also have they've committed to make sure that your money is not being put towards fossil fuel investment. So just a couple of examples. So then if you're looking at investments, so again, it's kind of similar process. Reading the impact reports to determine how assets are screened for inclusion in a fund is important. You have to check also for fossil fuel investment in a fund's prospectus. So there'll be like a list of what that ETF or that fund is holding in its portfolio. And you'll be able to see, if there's any companies in there that you recognize that are linked to fossil fuel, that you'll be able to see that there. Like I mentioned before, like anything that's labeled as an ESG fund, you really need to look carefully at to make sure it's moving towards an impact type of metric. Some can be labeled like fossil fuel free. A good way to like look at this to make sure things are divested, As You Sow's fossilfreefunds.org does a good job. You can type in like a ticker for a fund, and they will give you kind of a report on like how divested that fund is. And then if you don't want to do this yourself, there are robo-advisors now who can help you do this. A robo-advisor, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like a Wealthfront or a Betterment. Essentially, like you can kind of decide how much you want to invest over time, and you can kind of decide like what your risk profile is in terms of how risky the investments are. And then they have, their algorithms to help, manage all of that for you. A lot of them are now coming out with either socially responsible portfolios, impact portfolios. And so it's important to kind of look at, again, at like what those funds are holding, because sometimes it just ends up being a bunch of ESG funds, which I think arguably is better than nothing. But you also don't want to pay a premium for something that you think is doing one thing, like making an impact, and it might not necessarily be doing what you think it's doing. There is a climate-friendly robo-advisor, Carbon Collective. They are taking a climate-first approach. So they've kind of built out their index and like what funds are included with climate in mind, and screening out, the most carbon-intensive industries, putting in climate solutions as like to fill that gap, and then the rest of it's usually just standard, S&P 500 type of funds. But if you wanted to learn more about that, you should, look at their website and like their methodology. But just to let you know, like there are things out there that could help. And like I was saying, like all these different things. I mentioned a couple of these names. Everything here is kind of being branded as climate focused. And what I did mention is some of these are green, some of these are not so green. And so it's really overwhelming when you're trying to look at all this information and trying to do your due diligence and you just don't know which way to turn. And that's really what we're trying at GreenPortfolio to help you with. We want to make it easier for you to align your financial decisions with your values and avoid greenwashing. And so, you know, we're building out our product right now that will help you do this. Right now, if you go to our website, we need to update it a little bit, but we are focused on like at least giving you transparent reviews of some of these products to help you, you know, make a decision yourself on like what you want to do. And we're building this tool that will allow you, once you have a bank account or an investment, you can see like what your money is already up to. So we have a rating system that'll screen for positive and negative impact, and we can score out the investments in the bank accounts so you know where you stand as a backer of fossil fuels or as an investor in a greener future. And we'll be able to give you, you know, the recommended list that you'll see on our site of like suggestions on maybe where to turn if you decide you do not like where your money is currently being held. All just to make it easier for you to align your money with climate focused values. And so, you know, with that, you know, that's my presentation for you. You can, you know, check out more information on our website. You can follow us on social media. I will throw my email address in the chat too. If you ever want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to answer questions or tell you more. Thanks for joining us. So we really wanted to open it up now for questions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was like very coherent and a good, just short and sweet, but like informative. I think heads are rolling. So very curious to hear where everyone's landing. There's lots of commotion in the chat, just like side eyes and and things like that. And also just naming, a lot of us are also based in Canada. So there's a few, not A, did you hear that? Whoa. Yeah, just some of those like investment, sustainable investing trackers are like US only, which can be a barrier, but
this is great though. Like we do have a lot of US focus right now, but we do want to look at what's going on in Canada. So yeah, if I'll take a look through this chat. But yeah, anything that comes to mind of like where you're banking or what you're seeing, what you think might be green, like throw it in here. Like I'll start taking a look at it.
Yeah, that would be great. And we had Dalen share a bunch of robo-advisors that are like Canadian options as well. So that's I captured those. We can send those out as well. But
awesome.
That's great. But yeah, feel free, folks, to jump in the chat, or you can even just unmute, unmask yourselves if you'd like as well on video. And yeah, feel free to ask some questions.
How does Wealthfront? Okay, I'll have to get back to you on Wealthsimple because they're not as really prevalent in the US, but that's something that we can, you know, take a look at for you in the future. Looking at the rest of the questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, learning lots in the chat as well, and for the presentation, it's just been fantastic. I was going to ask about, like, some of the interest was going towards nonprofits. What are the different yields and different interest rates that are kind of projected in, you know, more like, you know, these kind of like packages and portfolios, and what can kind of be expected? Because like the hard thing is trying to grow your money against inflation, but also trying to grow your money in an ethical way that's actually going to help. I know that, yes, with investing, exactly that great question. How do you balance social justice? Thank you. Thank you for wording my question much better. With investing, because a big thing is too that economists do predict that our generation won't be able to retire You're not building those we're not accessing huge barriers to other assets, such as housing. So we're not going to have the same potential for retirement savings. So how can we keep longevity in our investing to have, that's something that is sustainable, but also going to yield something that gives us security, financial independence, and potential for retirement that takes us away from dependency on like employers, in the sense we can actually leave the workforce and have that. Yeah.
Sure. That's a great question. So what I would say is it's important when you're looking at funds and looking at robo-advisors to see how things have been back tested. So some of these like newer funds or newer robo-advisors, these portfolios, they will tell you like how long they've back tested it, and how, even if it's like a hypothetical, and what they tested it against. And so I think that's really important, because I agree, like it's tough balancing climate, also social investing, and profitability. I personally, not GreenPortfolio, I personally am a firm believer that you can balance these things, but it does take, a bit of time. Different types of market conditions also like make it tougher. But yeah, I suggest looking at the back testing. A lot of them will compare against like an S&P 500 or more like a standard portfolio. So I think that's really key, is looking at that. Another question in here, and with the banks, I can't speak to like the interest rates and the yield on the bank accounts right now. I just don't know that offhand, but I do know that a lot of them are trying to now be comparable to like a bigger bank, because that's important to people. I guess the one thing that has been helpful over the past couple of years is like like with our generations, like having access to a physical bank is not necessarily as critical. And so I think that's been giving some of these more like either B Corp banks or banks focused on like climate or social responsibility, like a little bit more of like a level playing field. Let's see. Let's see, questions. I think there was a question in here. How do you balance social justice and investing? Yeah, it's tough. So we decided to focus, our rating at this point and like our assessment solely on climate. It's just currently our preference, and it's not to say that we wouldn't expand further, but when you start to chunk E, S, and G, as you mentioned here, like closer together in one score, you kind of end up with nothing in terms of like how it's being scored, because you could be good for climate, as you say, you could be bad for social or for governance. There was actually an Economist article on this, I think last week. So you kind of have to look at them individually, and then at this point, you have to make your own personal decision on how you want to assess those three areas. But I don't think like looking at just that holistic roll up ESG score helps, because it doesn't really tell you anything. Let's see. Other questions? Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't come prepared with more Canadian offerings, but I'm taking note of everything in here, and we'll get back to you. We are actually working on something of top 10 fossil fuel funders. TD is in there. We're working on an assessment of that. So that should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So more to come there. I think someone had a question here around offsets. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna speak to that as I raised my hand. Yeah, it might be too specific, but just curious because Sometimes, at least in like the global climates, I'm not sure about banks and other people, but sometimes carbon offsets they sound great, but then in reality, they're, for example, dispossessing people of their land or limiting access to lands in order to conserve the forest or whatever. And so there can be kind of ethical and social justice implications and violation of Indigenous rights. And so I don't know if you know much about that in this space, but I'm just curious.
So it's an area that is like on our list to start looking at. And I see Celeste was mentioning RBC. Yeah, RBC is in this report we're looking at too. They're making. But for offsetting, we've been looking more. What we've been seeing so far, first, like it's really important to try and reduce first, right? I think everyone probably on here knows that, right? But like moving towards reduction of your own emissions before you start offsetting, moving towards like a net zero for yourself, essentially. Yeah, what we've seen with offsets is they're definitely not all created equal. Anything, and I've only been looking at it really though from a climate perspective. I've not been looking at it from social rights. So that is something I need to start thinking about. But yes, I agree. Offsets are a form of greenwashing. It just depends on how they're being done. There are companies out there that are working on proper vetting of like the offset project or the carbon removal project that you would be contributing to like offset your footprint. Those tend to be more legitimate. Sometimes they'll cost more, right? Which is like a conundrum, right? Like it's unfortunate that you have to pay more to like offset effectively. So we're still wrapping our heads around how to fully assess that. Right now we're just looking at, are these legit? Or are they just having you plant trees and like not actually accounting for anything? And, you know, the tree's not going to mature for X amount of years. And like, what if it burns down? Like what happens to your offset? So we're looking for more legitimacy and transparency in how they're creating and validating these offsets and projects. And then the next layer of that we'll look at is like, how does it make sense for you to pay for it? And like figuring out that part of it in the assessment. I know this doesn't fully answer your question, but that's kind of where we're at with that on our side.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
I was also super curious when Sabrina mentioned offsets. I like just received a letter, like I'm home visiting, and I got this letter in the mail about the like $300 I was going to receive as like a direct deposit, as like Canada is doing this like climate action incentive plan, and they're paying families of 4 like a set amount of money. I think it varies per province, but I believe it's related to offsetting, and I'm just not entirely sure what the vibe is. I'm always like very critical of like government incentive plans to begin with, but I was just wondering if that yeah, just what the vibe actually was. And I do have to look more into it, but I think it is related to offsetting. And I think there's always this like use of like paying folks up front, especially like paying families and receiving some incentive as like a look at this money and we're saving the earth and offsetting carbon. But I find it a little suspicious. So I wanted to look more into that.
I'll have to look into this more for you, Celeste. I'm not going to have an answer for you right now.
Okay. I was like, Mom, what is this? I think Caitlin has some thoughts to share.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I can jump in with a quick explanation of the climate action rebate. So basically what happened is the federal government wanted to implement a carbon tax, but a lot of provinces didn't want to. So the federal government said to provinces that if you don't want to implement a system, we'll implement one that basically takes all of the carbon tax revenue generated in that province and then gives 90% of it back to families as rebates, and then 10% goes to municipalities and corporations. So I wouldn't exactly call it carbon offsetting. It was more just a more politically popular way to get a carbon tax passed, in that it equally provides each family or individual with the same amount of a rebate based on the average amount they've paid into the carbon tax. So it kind of incentivizes them to use more green options. And another thing I'll just quickly add is I saw a lot of like the neobanks and online banks pop up in the chat. I'd say a really important thing for some of them, like Tangerine and Simply, is that they're actually owned by the large banks and they're just different trade names for them. So make sure to check the ownership of those banks before you sign up.
That's a great point. Really interesting about the carbon tax too. We need that here. I guess I have a question for all of you. You know, when you're thinking about this, like do you think about like using your banking like choices as a tool in like your climate action toolkit, or is it something that you think is more just like a nice to have?
I can pop in here. I think it's interesting because I was like part of fossil fuel divestment at my university and very much into the divestment movement. And I think there has been pushes around that for banks, and especially for like big pension funds, for example, to divest from fossil fuels. And I think a lot of young people that I've spoken to, we just feel like the amount of money that we make, and like I think what Rose was saying about like just our financial stability and what we can expect in the future is so different than current, boomers, for example. And so we feel like a lot of our energy could be better spent influencing them on where they put their money. Though I think it is important, of course, what I do as well, but I can see that side of the argument as well.
I think that brings up such an important point that past generations who have the largest funds have the largest influence in what is going to happen and what, if there is going to be any change, very much to influence that. I also say like a major issue here, I'm in Nova Scotia, would be like Nova Scotia Power, EMRA. I don't know if everyone's familiar with them. But like most of the pensions, all the provincial pensions or any of the provincial jobs, positions are pretty much all held in there. So it's very hard, like even if you like, yeah, Serena would know. Basically, yeah, trying to fight them, as Serena would know, is really, really hard. But essentially, like, even if you don't try to do the funding, even if you're trying, sorry, I lose my point. Sometimes your job is sometimes out of your control where that pension is being invested. So sometimes it's just like out of your control, unfortunately. Yeah, so that's something I'm not really sure how to navigate, but
yeah, that is definitely, I have not figured out how to crack that one. We've been seeing that here too, and that's honestly one of the reasons why we founded GreenPortfolio. My co-founder Bonnie, she couldn't be here tonight, but like she's worked, in renewable energy in one way or another. She worked for like New York State, building out renewable energy projects, and she kept thinking like, well, wait, like, is my 401k like completely negating what I'm doing during the day? Like this seems completely messed up. And now like you're starting to see a lot more pressure, right? Like New York talked about divestment was last year. More pressure's coming. I mean, you've seen it also at the universities, right? Like it can happen. But it is tough, like if you're just one person trying to figure out what to do with that pension. I guess that my thought is no, sorry, I'm looking at the chat. I guess the other thought I had too, like when I've been talking to boomers, because we've been doing a lot of like talks with every generation and like finding out what people are concerned about is you do need to be the squeaky wheel in your parents and your grandparents world. It is really, really tough and cumbersome since they're all typically so entrenched in like the bank they're in and like where their investments are. The number one thing I hear is like, it's going to take me too much time to move stuff around. Like, I don't want to deal with this. So you have to start being really annoying. And if you can point them to things that help them, like, figure out how to do it and like where it should go, that will work. That's when I hear it. Like my granddaughter like pretty much yelled at me, or like my kids are nagging me all the time about this. Like those are the people that start to look at it. There are obviously also boomers who really care about this, right? And are super passionate about it. I don't want to like generalize everybody, but yeah, it's that's the biggest thing I've seen. And one of the things we're working on is trying to look at like how like the actions of like individuals can actually become something bigger and more powerful and drive action at like a company level or a bank level. And like we believe that we've been trying to do the math on this, and like if we can get enough people to switch from like one company to something that's more climate positive, or one bank that's like to one that's more climate positive, seeing those drops and seeing that influence and the pressure that can give on those corporation banks, like it can make an impact. And we're actually in the process of calculating that from like a emission standpoint, like based on a ton of obviously assumptions, but we're working on that on our side.
Yeah, that was actually, you spoke to exactly what I wanted to ask Elizabeth. So same waves, but yeah, that's a question I had when you asked around like personal finances and activism. I think for me, like the tension point is kind of like understanding what it actually looks like as individuals, but as like collective entities to divest from banks, like big banks, and like what does that actually mean for the bank? Like how do we get banks' attention? Is there any like record of that making the impact that we want it to have? Like what are some effective tools essentially to actually destabilize banks through our like decision making or like investments? Because like my checking savings is not doing anything for every, like I know very well they are not grouping my $500, but like I wonder just like what it means to get their attention in like mass amounts, if like mass amounts of folks were like closing their accounts, or just like I haven't really seen that in action, but I know we're thinking about it, and like there have been like waves of that. So I'm just thinking about like, yeah, tools, I guess, to get
tools. So there is a group. The problem is I don't know how active they are in Canada. But because I think they're focused more on US policy, but maybe there's something in Canada too. But Climate Change Makers like focuses on like an hour of action in a week, and like they give you something to do and you go do it. And like I think a few weeks ago it was like bug everybody about this certain bill, right? And like email, here's your template, like email everyone in government that you can, right? That's related to your jurisdiction. Someone, let's say Dalen just put in banking on a better future. That's awesome. Yeah, Fridays for Future. They've been doing some stuff as well. So I would say hooking up with some of them, like the youth movements in this space. Sunrise has done some stuff too. But that will help, right? They'll have the resources that you need to really like make the message heard. You're in Sunrise? That's awesome. Looking at the chat.
We don't have Sunrise in Canada, but I'm with Climate Strike Canada, which is our like Fridays for Future version. And
Awesome.
we work with Sunrise closely, where there's a front-loading project underway right now. And yeah, Divest Canada falls under us. But yeah, Banking on a Better Future is kind of designed to be like our home for all of our current finance campaigns. So I'll just give a quick shout out. We're doing a TMX Divestment Week of Action. So we're having events at RBC branches. I know from your slides, they're the 5th largest funder of fossil fuels in the world, largest in Canada. So yeah, if you're able to, feel free to check it out on socials, and we would love to see you on the streets.
Love that.
There's also a reflection here, Chuck. If you want to speak it out, I also can. I think it's a really important reflection on, yeah, like being forced into making kind of like non-ethical choices as like activists who hold these values, and just what does it actually look like to navigate activism. That Chuck, feel free to speak on that more if anyone has responses to that. But I feel like that's that like never ending like loophole question that like may not have solid answers.
Yeah. The way I look at that is we all have to like operate in like the constraints that we have and do the best we can with like what we have available to us and like what we can and can't control. And I think if you yourself know that you're doing like what you can, you know, if people aren't realizing that, then that shouldn't be on you. I know like some people like, you know, people have to drive, right? Like I think about this with cars all the time. Like not everyone can take mass transit, or not everyone can afford an electric vehicle. Some people, you know, are still driving gas cars. Like it is what it is. Like you know, but what you can do is like, you know, do your research like on trying to find a fuel efficient vehicle. Do your research on like what I'm hopefully gonna be able to provide you, like which oil and gas company is like not as bad as the other ones, like to go fill. And then if it's like close by, like go to that one to fill up your tank. You know, like you have to, don't be too hard on yourself, I guess is also what I'm trying to say. That's my perspective. I don't know how everyone else feels.
We're all thinking about the credit union we're going to start together. No, that's very good advice, Elizabeth. Yeah, I appreciate you.
You should though. That'd be awesome.
No, but genuinely, like, yeah, I feel like there's a push right now to think about financials in like radically different ways, especially among like youth who also have like racialized, like marginalized identities as well, just because like money matters have always been like in community, like in families, and there have always been ways to keep our money tight and like invested. And so just thinking about, yeah, what that means for the future, and you know, whether that's like creating credit unions, more of that, or like cooperatives. Yeah, I know there's already a lot of this work being done, but there is hope for non-bank futures.
Let's see a question here. I'm not so sure how to respond to this. Let's see. Would it be unreasonable to require that all of your employees use specific banks? I don't know if I can actually respond to that because I also don't know Canadian labor law. I don't know if we'd be able to do that in the US. Oh, ethically. I think you could probably strongly suggest. I don't know if you could actually say it has to be there. Because again, everyone's working in their own constraints.
Are there resources for, I guess that's what GreenPortfolio will be serving as well, but for organizations to find pension funds and things like that that are going to be green. Yeah, going to be, are they able to find resources on how to, move past that if an organization would wish to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know in the US, it's something that's starting to be discussed. A lot of what's happened here, like financial advisors aren't allowed to really use corporations aren't allowed to necessarily use like an ESG fund like in their 401k, just because of like more like risk tolerance and things like that. And that is, there are proposals around like adjusting that. And then there are like fossil free options now that are starting to pop up. So one of them is called, and I don't know if they're in Canada. It's called Sphere. And so they have like an IRA option if you can actually roll over yourself, but they are going on a lot of like the exchanges like that the companies are using here. So that way it can be offered actually in a corporation's 401k plan. But that's one of the only ones that I'm aware of at this time. So it's a pretty new concept here. So I'm assuming it's I would hope that Canada is actually further along, but I know the pension part of it makes it a little bit more difficult.
Elizabeth, what is an IRA equivalent in Canada, if you know?
So it's an individualized like retirement account. So it's not a 401k that's offered by your company, but it is like a retirement fund option that you can put money into.
Gotcha. So RSP. So neat how it's just changes.
And kind of off topic, but the 401k, I learned the history on it was very interesting how it went from the 80s from pensions traditionally to 401ks and how that introduced more risk. And originally it was just like this small thing used for investors, and it became popularized, and became adopted by companies. So companies didn't have to pay into these big pension funds anymore. Yeah.
Well, we're at the 8 o'clock hour. I really enjoyed this, like speaking with you. I hope you gained something from it. I know I did. I know I learned a lot about Canadian banking, and that I have a lot to learn about Canadian banking. And we're gonna make sure that we start to like add that in. We actually have like interns that are based in Canada, and so I think we can start to like slowly work our way in on this for you. And thank you for having me, Celeste. This has been wonderful.
As I'm typing, thank you so much, Elizabeth. The energy was just very vibrant in this